Um, when you think of the 1920s, what is the first image that hits your brain?
Oh, I mean, it's almost cinematic, right?
Yeah, basic.
It's The Great Gatsby. It's flappers dancing, the Charleston, the cars, the parties, that massive skyline of New York rising up.
Right, it's jazz music blaring from these newfangled radios and just this explosion of art and culture. We call it the Roaring Twenties for a reason.
It is a very seductive image.
It is. There's this pervasive idea that it was just a decade-long party where everyone was getting rich, drinking illicit champagne, and having the time of their lives right before the hangover of the 1930s hit.
Yeah, but that is really just the pop culture version. Because if you dig into the economic data, which is our mission for this deep dive today, that image isn't just incomplete. It's essentially a mirage.
A mirage.
Yeah, it masks the reality that the 1920s were actually a period of profound struggle and desperation for a huge chunk of the world.
It's kind of like looking at an Instagram feed of a luxury vacation, right? Where everything looks perfect and sun-drenched, but just out of frame, the hotel is literally on fire.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Because today, we are doing a deep dive into the interwar period, so roughly 1918 to 1939. And we aren't just reciting dates here.
No, not at all.
We need to figure out how the global order went from the sheer optimism of ending the war to end all wars to the single most catastrophic economic collapse in human history in just over a decade.
And it is a terrifying trajectory to look at. We're talking about a fragile recovery that was built entirely on a foundation of sand. And when that foundation collapsed, it didn't just ruin bank accounts, it broke societies.
And that's a key distinction I want to make early on for you listening. Before you tune out thinking this is just going to be about stock charts and interest rates, let me stop you. This isn't just about money.
No, it's so much bigger than that.
This is about how economic desperation rewrites the social contract. It changes how men and women relate to each other, it changes culture, and crucially, it creates the perfect petri dish for political monsters to grow.
Right. You absolutely cannot understand the rise of fascism and extremism in the 1930s without understanding the structural economic rot of the 1920s. They are one and the same story.
They're completely linked.
Completely. You don't get Hitler without the hyperinflation of 1923 and the crash of 1929.
Okay, so let's get into the machinery of this disaster. We have to start where the previous disaster ended, 1918. The guns fall silent, the Treaty of Versailles is signed, the world takes a breath.
But Europe isn't celebrating. It's starving.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, if we look at the sources, let's look at Germany.
Germany is the epicenter of this.
It really is. You have to remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, they are saddled with massive war reparations. The Allies, particularly France, demanded payments that were, frankly, mathematically impossible for a shattered economy to meet.
So Germany was effectively insolvent from day one.
Exactly.
And this leads to an economic event that is honestly hard to comprehend. Like, we complain about inflation today when eggs go up $1 or gas prices spike. But what happened in Germany in 1923 is, well, it defies logic. It sounds like fiction.
It's the textbook definition of hyperinflation.
Yeah.
But we need to understand why it happened. It wasn't an accident.
Right.
Germany couldn't pay its bills. So France occupied the Ruhr Valley, which was Germany's industrial heartland, to essentially take payment in goods like coal and steel.
Which, understandably, the Germans didn't love.
Right, they hated it. So the German workers went on strike in protest, passive resistance. But now the German government has a massive problem. They have to pay millions of striking workers to keep them alive and patriotic, but the government has zero production and zero income.
So they are writing checks with an empty bank account.
Exactly. So they chose the only option they felt they had left.
Yeah.
They turned on the printing presses. They just printed money to pay the bills. And once that cycle started, they couldn't stop. The more they printed, the less the money was worth, so they had to print even more.
The numbers in the source material here are mind-blowing. In 1914, before the war, the exchange rate was 4 German marks to 1 US dollar. 4 to 1.
Right, very standard.
By November 1923, 1 US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks.
Trillions with a T.
Trillion. At that point, money ceases to be a store of value and just becomes litter.
Yeah.
You see those famous photos of kids building forts out of stacks of cash, or people burning money for heat because it was literally cheaper to burn the money than to buy firewood.
There are stories of people ordering a cup of coffee at a cafe for 5,000 marks. And by the time they finished drinking it, the price was 8,000 marks.
That is insane.
It wiped out the middle class instantly. If you had a pension or life savings or a war bond, it was gone. You were destitute overnight.
It psychologically broke the nation. And this is the pivot point where that Roaring Twenties illusion starts. They actually managed to stop the bleeding.
Yes. Enter the Dawes Plan of 1924.
Okay, unpack this for us. It sounds like a boring piece of bureaucracy.
It does, but it was essentially a massive global bailout.
How did it work?
The Dawes Plan did two things. First, it rationalized the reparations. It tied the payments to Germany's actual ability to pay. But second, and much more importantly, it opened the floodgates for U.S. capital.
Okay, this is the American angle. The U.S. emerges from the war as the world's banker.
Yes, exactly. American banks and private investors started pouring massive loans into Germany. Billions of dollars. They rebuilt the factories, they stabilized the currency.
But let's trace that money, because when you map it out based on the analysis, it seems like a shell game.
It really does.
American banks lend money to Germany. Germany uses that money to rebuild and pay reparations to France and Britain. And then France and Britain use that money to pay back their war debts to the United States.
You've nailed the circular absurdity of it. It was a closed loop. The sources call it the triangle of debt. As long as the American money kept flowing in, the system worked. Germany recovered, Berlin became a massive cultural hub, and there was genuine optimism in the air.
That optimism peaked around 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which, looking back, feels incredibly naive, but at the time, it was serious business.
It was huge. Dozens of nations signed a treaty literally renouncing war as a tool of foreign policy. They made war illegal.
They genuinely believed they fixed it.
Yeah, they thought the combination of American credit and international diplomacy had solved the problem of human conflict forever.
But the reality was they hadn't fixed anything fundamentally. They had just put the entire global economy on a credit card, and the credit limit was about to be reached.
That is the perfect analogy. The recovery was fragile because it wasn't built on organic growth or real wealth generation in Europe. It was built on debt, specifically American debt.
This brings us to the core of this deep dive. We need to dismantle the crash itself. Most people have this idea that one day in October 1929, the stock market crashed, and suddenly everyone was poor.
Right, that's the common myth.
But the sources we're looking at paint a much more complex picture. It wasn't a sudden heart attack. It was more like a slow-motion poisoning.
The crash of '29 was just the trigger. The dynamite had been piling up for a decade. The sources identify four distinct structural weaknesses. Let's call them the four horsemen of the economy, that everyone just ignored because the party was too loud.
Let's break these down because they are eerily relevant to today. Horseman number one, war debt. We touched on this with the Dawes Plan.
Right. The entire global system was locked in this rigid web of debt. Germany owed the Allies owed the U.S. This meant that the global economy wasn't flexible at all.
It was brittle.
Exactly. If one link in that chain snapped, if one nation defaulted, the whole web would collapse. There was zero resilience in the system.
Okay, horseman number two, nationalistic tariffs. Now, we hear about tariffs a lot today, but in the 1920s, this was a specific policy failure, wasn't it?
It was a massive reaction to fear. Nations wanted to protect their own struggling industries. They thought, if we tax imports, people will buy domestic goods, and that will save our jobs.
Which, I mean, sounds logical on the surface. Buy American or buy British.
Sure. It sounds great politically.
Sure.
But when everyone does it simultaneously, it's a disaster. It's strangled global trade.
Because you're locking everyone out.
Right. You make it expensive for other countries to sell to you, so they have no money to buy your exports. Instead of protecting jobs, it killed the international markets that those jobs relied on. It was basically a circular firing squad.
Wow. Okay, horseman number three is one that I think often gets overlooked. Overproduction. The hidden crisis.
This one is vital, especially regarding agriculture. During World War I, global production, both farms and factories, ramped up to total war levels.
They were just pumping out goods.
They were producing as much wheat, corn, and steel as physically possible to feed armies and build tanks. Plus, you had mechanization happening. Tractors and combines were making farms more efficient than ever before.
But then the war ends in 1918. The armies go home, the demand drops off a cliff.
But the production didn't slow down. You had wartime supply flooding into a peacetime market. And basic economics tells us that when supply crushes demand, prices tank.
So agricultural prices hit the floor. This means farmers were actually living in a depression years before 1929.
Exactly. The Roaring Twenties never roared for rural populations in the U.S. or Europe. They were drowning in debt and surplus crops. So you have a huge chunk of the population that can't buy anything, which weakens the whole economy from the bottom up.
And finally, horseman number 4, financial speculation. The Wolf of Wall Street stuff.
The U.S. stock market mania. There was a widespread, delusional belief that stocks would just go up forever. It became a cultural obsession.
People getting stock tips from their barbers and taxi drivers.
Yeah, but it wasn't just that people were investing. It was how they were investing. They were buying on margin.
Okay, can you clarify the risk of buying on margin for us? Because it sounds like a technical finance term, but it's actually just gambling.
It is entirely gambling. It's borrowing money to buy stocks. You put down maybe 10% of the cash, your own money, and you borrow the other 90% from a broker.
Okay.
If the stock goes up, you pay back the loan and you keep a massive profit. It feels like magic.
But if the stock goes down even a little bit,
You don't just lose your investment. You face a margin call. The broker demands their money back immediately. If you don't have it, they sell your stock and you still owe the massive debt.
Right.
And the bank that lent you the money, they're in trouble too.
wow.
It links the stock market directly to the stability of the banking system itself.
So, to recap the scene in 1929 for you listening, the world is drowning in circular debt, trade is strangled by tariffs, farmers are broke from overproduction, and the only thing keeping the lights on is reckless gambling on Wall Street using borrowed money.
That is the house of cards. It was just waiting for a breeze to knock it over.
And then, in October 1929, someone opened a window. The U.S. stock market crashes. But here is the million-dollar question from the sources. Why did a crash on Wall Street destroy a factory in Berlin or a mine in Wales?
Because of that circular flow of money we talked about. Remember, Germany was running on American loans.
Right.
The moment the U.S. market crashed, American investors panicked. They faced those margin calls we just discussed. They needed liquidity cash immediately.
So they looked at their overseas investments.
And they pulled the plug. They repatriated their capital. They stopped the loans to Germany and demanded repayment.
So the lifeline was cut.
Instantly.
Yeah.
And because the European recovery was tethered entirely to that American money, the European economy just stopped. Banks failed, like the Creditanstalt in Austria, which was a huge domino to fall. Factories closed, and unemployment skyrocketed.
The human cost here is staggering. We read the numbers in the analysis, and they honestly look like typos. By 1932, unemployment in Great Britain was 25%, 1 in 4 people.
And in Germany, it hit nearly 40%.
40%. Just imagine walking down your street today. Nearly half the people you see have no job, no income, and no hope.
And this brings us to a really fascinating and often overlooked social dynamic that the sources highlight. The crisis didn't hit everyone the same way. It had a profound warping effect on gender roles.
I found this part of the research really compelling. We tend to think of unemployment as just a people problem, but it was specifically a male problem initially, wasn't it?
Yes. The first sectors to collapse were heavy industry, steel, coal, manufacturing. In the 1930s, these were exclusively male-dominated jobs, so men were the first to be mass-fired.
But the service sector clerks, domestic work, laundry, those jobs managed to survive a bit better.
And those were often female-dominated jobs. And because they were lower paid, employers were less eager to cut them. So you had this widespread situation in millions of households where the husband, the traditional culturally mandated breadwinner, was sitting at home, unemployed, often for years. Meanwhile, the wife was the only one bringing in a paycheck.
In the context of the 1930s, that wasn't just an economic shift. That was a cultural earthquake.
It was humiliating for many men. It reversed traditional domestic power dynamics. The sources point out that this caused significant social resentment. There was a deep sense of emasculation and anger among men who felt they had lost their purpose, their entire status as providers.
Which, and we have to be honest about the psychology here, is a dangerous emotion. When you have millions of angry, unemployed men who feel like the world has stripped them of their dignity, where does that energy go?
It creates a massive demand for a strong man. It makes people susceptible to rhetoric that says, I will restore your pride. I will put you back to work. I will make us strong again. I will make men again.
It's high-octane fuel for extremism. We'll come back to the consequences of that. But first, I want to look at how governments actually tried to fix this. Because this era wasn't just about failure. The sources call it a laboratory of democracy.
That's a great phrase for it. You have to realize the old rule book, laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that you just let the market fix itself, was dead. It clearly wasn't working. So Western democracies started radically experimenting to stop revolutions from happening.
Let's take a tour of these experiments. First stop, Great Britain. They went for a national government. What was the logic there?
Britain went for stability through unity. The crisis was so severe that the traditional political enemies, the Conservative and Liberal parties, agreed to form an emergency coalition.
It's like the Hatfields and McCoys agreeing to run a bed and breakfast together just to keep the roof from caving in.
Pretty much. And it was somewhat effective. It wasn't exciting, and it definitely didn't solve the underlying poverty quickly. You still had hunger marches like the Jarrow Crusade, but it provided political stability. It prevented the kind of chaotic polarization we saw elsewhere.
Then you have France. They went a totally different direction with the Popular Front in 1936. This feels much more politically charged.
It was very charged. The Popular Front was a coalition of leftists, socialists, and Democrats specifically banding together to prevent a fascist takeover, which they saw happening right next door in Germany and Italy. It was a defensive alliance.
Did it work economically, though?
Mixed results. They achieved some massive social gains for workers. Mandatory vacation time, shorter hours, the right to strike. These were huge victories.
Right.
But economically, they couldn't fix the inflation and the stagnation.
Yeah.
It left France politically fractured and very weak right before World War II.
But then we look north to Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Finland. Our sources suggest they figured out something the rest of the world missed entirely.
The Scandinavian model, or the middle way. This is really where the modern welfare state was born. While the rest of the world was fighting a bitter war between communism and capitalism, Scandinavia basically said, why not both?
How did that actually work in practice?
They focused heavily on cooperative enterprises, businesses owned by the members or the farmers, so the profits stayed local. And crucially, they accepted high taxes to fund a massive social safety net.
So instead of letting the unemployed starve and radicalize, the state stepped in to ensure basic survival.
Exactly. They insulated their population from the worst effects of the market crash. And by doing that, they kept democracy stable. While German streets were filled with brown shirts fighting communists, Scandinavia stayed relatively calm because their people weren't desperate enough to burn the system down.
And speaking of the state stepping in, we cannot talk about this era without mentioning the man who essentially rewrote the economic operating system, John Maynard Keynes.
Keynesianism. This is probably the most important intellectual shift of the 20th century.
So let's unpack this for everyone listening. Before Keynes, the standard wisdom was the Austrian school, or classical economics. If the economy crashes, the government should tighten its belt, right? Austerity.
Exactly. You treat the government like a household. If you have no income, you stop spending, you balance the budget, you cut services.
And Keynes came along and said, that's suicide.
He argued that the government is not a household. He identified what he called the paradox of thrift. If everyone stops spending because they are scared, consumers, businesses, everyone, the economy just dies.
Right, because my spending is your income.
Exactly. So in that specific moment of crisis, the government is the only entity big enough to spend money and create demand.
So deficit spending, spend money you don't even have.
Yes, pump money into the economy, build roads, build bridges, dam rivers. Keynes famously joked that the government could pay people to dig holes and fill them up again, and it would still help the economy because those people would have wages to spend.
It doesn't matter what you build, just put money in people's pockets. Because if they have money, they buy food. If they buy food, the grocer pays the farmer. If the farmer gets paid, he buys a tractor.
It's called priming the pump. It was a radical idea that the government is directly responsible for the economic health of the nation. It heavily influenced the New Deal in the U.S., but it took a long time for Europe to fully embrace it.
So let's zoom out. We looked at the fake party of the 20s, the structural flaws, the crash itself, and the desperate attempts to fix it. When you look at this entire arc from 1918 to 1939, what is the big takeaway from all these sources?
For me, it's about interconnectedness. The global economic crisis proved that the world had become a single organism. You couldn't isolate yourself behind borders anymore. When the U.S. sneezed, Europe didn't just catch a cold, it caught pneumonia.
And the tragedy is that the institutions just weren't ready for that reality. They were trying to solve global problems with nationalistic solutions.
And that failure had the ultimate cost. We talked about that 40% unemployment in Germany. We talked about the emasculation and the anger.
The fertile ground.
Exactly. You cannot separate the economics from the politics. The failure of the democratic systems to fix that misery provided the opening for extremist political movements to rise. Hitler didn't rise in a vacuum.
No.
He rose because he could point to the chaos, point to the starving children and say, democracy failed you. Capitalism failed you. I can fix it.
And people listened. Not necessarily because they were evil or because they bought into the racial ideology initially, but because they were just hungry.
It's a stark reminder that political stability is fundamentally built on economic stability. You can't have one without the other. If you let the economic floor fall out, the political ceiling will eventually collapse too.
It really makes you think about the hidden structures in our own economy today. We see the stock market numbers hitting record highs, we see the GDP growth, but what are the structural weaknesses lying just beneath the surface? What is our war debt? What is our margin debt?
That is the question we should always be asking. We are just as interconnected today, if not more so.
Here is a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. We tend to think of prosperity as money in the bank. But if a prosperous society is built entirely on debt and speculation like the 1920s, is it actually prosperous? Or is it just a ticking time bomb waiting for the bill to come due?
History suggests the bill always comes due.
On that cheery note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking beneath the surface, and we'll catch you next time.